We're looking at today is a focus on documentary evidence. So at the moment we have just spoken predominantly about archaeological evidence, the findings that we get from archaeological sites that are uncovered and then used to formulate interpretations of the past. These are only some of the forms of evidence that historians use in order to build their arguments and their accounts of the past. We rely on documentary evidence in conjunction with archaeological evidence to build a complete picture of the past. And the ancient writers are vitally important in helping us to understand what happened in ancient history. So, in contrast to archaeological evidence, written sources contain the first-hand accounts, the opinions and maybe more detail on what happened during their time most of all. Even though many ancient writers are writing about a time in which they didn't live in, so they may not necessarily be writing about their own time, we still refer to them as primary sources. In ancient history, the distinction between primary and secondary isn't necessarily as clear as what we have in modern history. We would still regard Herodotus as a primary source, even though he himself, was not alive during the Persian Wars. He is gathering evidence of the Persian Wars based on accounts, his own travels, his conversations with people who were there at the time. So we would still regard him as a primary source. Obviously, there are limitations to documentary evidence. Obviously, documentary evidence is much more prone to damage or to loss. And sometimes for some ancient writers, we only have fragments of their full works. It's also worth noting that the ancient text represents only a very small portion of society. These are mostly men who are educated elite. Many people are not writing and contributing to an account of the past during this particular time. It is mainly for those who are highly educated, men who are writing about only predominantly the official documents, official historical records, and literary works. We don't have a lot of social histories during this time. So it's very difficult for us to get an understanding of the full spectrum of society, but these are the records that we use to build an understanding about the administration, about the government, and they may give us some insight into other more social and cultural factors such as religion or social status. One writer that we're going to particularly focus on in today's tutorial is on Plutarch. He is a Greek historian and biographer who writes during the time of Nero, so he's during the Roman era. And his work, The Parallel Lives, is one of the most famous. So Plutarch is writing during this age known as the Second Sophistic, and he's trying to use his histories as an educational guidebook or a tool to understand the current issues of what are facing the Republic. So he's looking back into the past and trying to work out, with regards to his parallel lives, the qualities and the vices of what make up good leaders and bad leaders, And he's using this as an understanding for the Republic. So you can see here that his quote here, an imbalance between rich and poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics. He's looking at, that longitudinally, we can see that the same issues that we see now in the current time of which he's living, during the Roman Republic, during the time of Nero, we can see that these issues have been faced by previous societies before that. So the Second Sophistic is an important time in which we see many historical works being developed. We see historians of this age, and you can see some of them and mentioned there, choosing to emulate their predecessors, Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon, the more thrilling writers and more thrilling ones to read. Polybius, we haven't looked at him in much detail because he's very, very boring. He gets slandered a lot of the time because his account of the past is very dry and sort of not similar to the kind of gripping works that we see of Herodotus and Thucydides. Many writers believe that style was more important than substance. They don't, even though Thucydides has a much more focus on the methodology and having more of a scientific method, trying to understand causation, it's still style and a gripping read is more important necessarily than a really strict methodology and something that's really true and accurate. Early histories were reworked and rewritten, okay, rather than researched anew according to the academic principles. So we get this idea of this focus on reworking previous histories as opposed to further research and further development during this period of time. So Plutarch is born in a place called in Chaeronea. Okay, it is here, okay, on the border of Phocis and Boeotia. He's born before AD 50. Okay, he died around 120 CE. He traveled widely during his time, visiting Italy, Egypt, and he also taught in Rome. He had numerous influential friends, okay, including consuls. These are in the social and political hierarchy of Rome. He served as a priest at Delphi. We will talk about the oracle at Delphi and the religious role in that in quite some time, but it's an honorary position. This shows that he's one of the elite. And he may have served as an imperial procurator in Achaia under Hadrian. He wrote his parallel lives. The focus of them is comparing one Greek and one Roman. This promoted this idea of partnership between Greece and Rome. Okay, Greece, the educator, the sort of social and cultural kind of hub of the Mediterranean world. Okay, Rome as building on the successes of Greece as the great power, seeing the fruition of the things that have come before them. Plutarch wrote many works, but most of them are now lost. His rhetorical works on practice of oratory, which is important in a public figure who had to speak persuasively. He is really obsessed with this idea of leaders and people who are part of the public scene. You can see that he would have been interested in this himself, being a member of the elite, being someone who would have had friends who were orators and who were involved in the political practices of ancient Rome. He wrote numerous moralia. Okay, so these are themes on popular moral philosophy. So how to tell a flatterer from a friend, how to progress in virtue. So these are kind of things about how to be a better person. How these issues that we face and ethical issues that we face in our daily lives. He also wrote many dialogues. Okay, or philosophical conversations. So you can see some of the titles there. And philosophical commentaries. This is a time where people are questioning life and their role in it, and most importantly, his fame led to several unattributed works. Okay, being in his corpus of work. Okay, such as on the education of children, which was influential during the Renaissance. So we have this similarities drawn between. Okay, looks similar to what Plutarch would have written during the time. So we have the parallel lives, okay, are the focus of what we're going to talk about. This is not only a focus because of Plutarch's importance, but it's also because he writes, one of his most famous is on Alexander the Great, which we will study in year 12. There we have 23 pairs, okay, with 19 comparisons. So he writes his biography of one and then his biography of another, and then he has a comparison in which he looks at the similarities and differences between the two, okay, of what, how they maybe overcome their particular vices, how they maybe succumb to particular challenges, or how they rose above them. In his life of Alexander, he gives us a lot of information about his methodology and how he would go about building his biography. He says that his aim is not to write a continuous political history. This is contra to Polybius, again, his predecessors, who were very much focused on having a narrative, chronological, sequential history of the past. Okay, his work is not that. Okay, it is to try to understand the careers of great men. Okay, he gives particular attention to the heroes, education, to significant anecdotes, and to character. So he's kind of building a bit of a mythology around, okay, what is the reason that these men became sort of so great? It follows a general sequence in terms of their life, but his works are not necessarily chronological. He goes in and out, and he will try to look at things that happen in their later life and look at the root cause of that, maybe in their family or in their education or in their treatment of women. This could be something that he tries to look at how their successes and their failures, were rooted back in their formative years. The general pattern is he talks about family, education, their debut into public life, the climaxes, the changes in fortune or attitude, are kind of a key turning point, the later years and death. So it kind of follows a kind of a hero's story. And it's perhaps one of the most influential single sources of history of the ancient world. His works have inspired many later works. A lot of William Shakespeare's work on the ancient societies are based on Plutarch's parallel lives. Plutarch also writes a very famous essay on the Mouth of Herodotus, who he regards as his, pro-Persian sympathies of the Boeotians especially, but not only the Thebans, So he writes a criticism. You can see here that the style of Herodotus as being free and simple and easily suiting itself to its subject has deceived many. So we have some criticisms of, classical historians that we see here. And he says that Herodotus is malicious in his portrayal of Boeotians and Corinthians. And he says that I think myself obliged to defend our ancestors and the truth against this part of his writing. So he says that there is particular areas of earlier historians that are incorrect and then should be defended. So we get some early evidence of conversations and this idea of reviewing happening in history, that people are questioning early histories and starting to think about, the reliability and the accuracy of them, and then start to question the credibility of the author itself. It is not a complaint about Herodotus' methodology. It's more about a criticism of his overall perspective. So what is a biography? You may have read a biography of a modern person. Biographies are not written by the person themselves. That would be an autobiography. But a biography is trying to give a sense about the basic life of the particular person. Its basic motivation is very similar to why people read biographies today, to learn about maybe people they aspire to be like, or people that have come from challenging backgrounds to develop into the person they are today. And Plutarch uses this as a bit of a guidebook for members of the Roman Republic. His biographies, as I mentioned before, don't follow a chronological or sequential kind of sequence, and so they're very difficult to kind of piece together what part of their life they're in at certain particular times. And we're going to look at later on, about what Plutarch's major focus is. So both genres, history and biography, are written in prose. And in the ancient world, history tends to focus on leading statesmen and generals. History has now been revised in modern times, and we start getting histories of social, different social classes. We start getting histories of women's, histories of people who've been marginalized as a part of society. And both genres are heavily interested in moral qualities, the virtues and vices of leading statesmen. And you can see here that in the beginning of Alexander's life, he writes that, "For it is not histories that I am writing." He says that this is not history, but their life, their biography, And in the most illustrious deeds, there is not always a manifestation of virtue and vice. So he's going to say that I'm not going to focus on the illustrious deeds. I'm not always going to focus on the major battles or their great speech or their kind of leading sort of major events in their life. I maybe might focus on the smaller parts, the anecdotal evidence, the things that show more about their character as opposed to just their role in these major events. It might be the slight thing like a phrase or a jest often makes a greater revelation about character than battles where thousands fall, or the greatest armaments or sieges of cities. History during the classical era is mainly focused on these things: battles, great armaments, sieges, cities, the major political upheavals during the time. For Plutarch, he's more interested in smaller events, anecdotal evidence, more about the person themselves as opposed to necessarily what they did. Both genres tend to assume that individuals, especially leading individuals, are primarily responsible for historical change. That the reason why we see changes in continuities in history is because of these great men. And it depends heavily on the attitudes of these great men. Plutarch is capable of distortion in order to emphasize vice or virtue. And like any historian, the interpretation of particular events leads to differing perspectives of the past. He's generally fair, okay, normally reliable as sources of which he relies on. So he is building his own life on other sources. He's building his life on the works of Polybius, of Xenophon, of Thucydides. He is prone to the same biases and the same issues of interpretation that earlier sources are also prone to. He doesn't necessarily, he's not heavily critical in terms of questioning and reviewing those base sources in any great depth. So we get a lot of the same types of issues with reliability and accuracy of the same earlier sources. So you can really clearly see where Plutarch is drawing his interpretations from. You can actually trace the base source back from Plutarch's work. Both genres use anecdotes, memorable stories. Okay, you can think about these kind of like as fables with some sort of moral idea about what it meant to show about their character. And you know, he thinks of himself, okay, like you can see here, like a painter, that he is painting a picture of the soul of men, okay, and he's not going to describe their greatness. He's not going to give an account of all the things that they did, but instead he's going to portray the life of each. And he's going to try and peer into the soul of the men, okay, their qualities and their virtues, okay, and people, what makes them who they are, as opposed to just a basic description. His lives does contain passages of historical narrative, okay, so we do see elements of this where he has to provide some kind of context around the particular person, but he then shifts and changes time sequences quite often as well. So what you are going to do is you're going to do something quite similar to what I've done in breaking down Plutarch, is you're going to go in out and think about your own writer, okay, you can choose either Didorius Siculus or Arrian, and you're going to develop an infographic focusing on the profile of one of these following writers. You need to include the following when you talk about the writer. You need to talk about their origin, so who they were, key works, famous sections. You need to talk about their purpose, so their methodology, their process when writing. You need to talk about their limitations, so criticisms that ancient and maybe modern historians have of them. And then finally, their value. What is their legacy overall to ancient history? How have they helped to inform our understanding of the past? So good luck with your infographic, and you should go back and have a look at this tutorial to help you to give some suggestions on some major focus points for your own.